Hey everyone, this is a piece from the appendices to The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism. This piece is by Abern, Bern, Burnham, and Shachtman. According to the table of contents, in a footnote it says, this is a bridge from Martin, Bern, Paul Bernick, James Burnham, and Max Shachtman. The original piece is titled, "What is at issue in the dispute on the Russian question? A statement of the position of the minority." End quote. This is from December 26, 1939. In this text, quote, Crux and quote, Lund are pen names for Trotsky. Okay, so here we go. What the 1939 to 40 dispute was about. The Canning Group insists that it is impossible to deduce a correct position on the defense of the Soviet Union without first deciding the question of the class character of the Soviet state. The minority, the Canning Group charges, is an unprincipled bloc because the minority is composed of comrades having different opinions on this question. It is true that Comrade Burnham, several weeks before the plenum of the National Committee, presented a resolution which proposed to revise the party position on the Soviet Union as a worker state. Why was this resolution withdrawn, and was it correct to do so? Why did comrades having different evaluations of the sociological nature of the Soviet Union unite on one resolution on the disputed Russian question, and was it correct to do so? In his article titled "The USSR in War," Comrade Trotsky writes, quote, "Our critics refuse to call the degenerated worker state a worker state. Our critics demand that the totalitarian bureaucracy be called a ruling class. The revolution against this bureaucracy our critics propose to consider not political, but social. Were we to make our critics these terminological concessions, we would place our critics in a very difficult position, inasmuch as our critics themselves would not know what to do with their purely verbal victory. It would therefore be a piece of monstrous nonsense to split with comrades who, on the question of the sociological nature of the USSR, have an opinion different from ours, insofar as they solidarize with us in general to the political tasks. But on the other hand, it would be blindness on our part to ignore purely theoretical and even terminological differences, because in the course of further development they may acquire flesh and blood and lead to diametrically opposite conclusions." End quote. Trotsky. The minority is united on a position which deals with the political tasks of the Fourth International on the Russian question. Regardless of the divergent views held on the sociological nature of the Soviet Union, all members of the minority believe that it would be monstrous nonsense to split among themselves on this point. The comrades of the minority are united not because the comrades of the minority are unprincipled and wish to conceal or suppress differences on the class nature of the Soviet state, but because of their agreement on the political tasks. Was it unprincipled to include in the united opposition bloc of the Russian Communist Party from 1926 to 1927 comrades who held that Russia was a worker state, and also those who held that it had ceased to be a worker state, but who were in agreement on the platform of the opposition, i.e. on the political conclusions and tasks? Was it unprincipled to include in that opposition comrades who held that the class nature of the Chinese Revolution was represented by the formula, quote, democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote, such as Zinoviev, and also comrades who held that its class nature was represented by the formula, quote, proletarian dictatorship supported by the peasantry, end quote, as in the case of Trotsky. But who were in agreement on the political tasks ahead? Independence of the Communist Party, Soviets, etc. It is true that these, quote, terminological, end quote, differences subsequently proved to have a greater importance. It is true in the present case also that, as Trotsky writes, quote, In the course of further development, they may acquire flesh and blood and lead to diametrically opposite conclusions, end quote. But it is impossible to write resolutions on the immediate political tasks of the party or in general to engage in political activities on the basis of differences that may develop in the future. Excuse me. Does this mean that the minority attaches no importance to the question of the class nature of the Soviet state? It means nothing of the kind. This was in no way implied by Burnham's withdrawal of his original document and the minority's support of Burnham's action. Exactly the contrary was not merely implied, but explicitly stated. When the Burnham resolution was first presented for discussion to the political committee, the Cannon Group was opposed to any discussion of it in the party. Comrade Cannon, in his letter to the National Committee, denounced a discussion of this resolution, or for that matter any discussion of the Russian question, as a, quote, luxury we cannot afford, end quote. End quote. The supporters of the Cannon Group voted solidly against all motions submitted by comrades in the party branches in New York asking the National Committee plenum to permit the opening of a discussion on the Russian question. Before the plenum, the Cannon Group and the political committee voted against even a theoretical discussion of the question in the party's theoretical organ, the New International. It was only after this utterly bureaucratic attitude became untenable in the party that the Cannon Group became the champion of a discussion on the, quote, fundamental questions, end quote, and on those alone. What did the minority propose? First, that the theoretical discussion is opened in the pages of the New International. Far from evading a discussion of the sociological nature of the Soviet state, the minority insisted on a discussion of the sociological nature of the Soviet state, and insisted on the discussion of the sociological nature of the Soviet state being conducted in the field and on the plain where it properly belongs. And when it became increasingly clear that the differences in the party were not confined to the, quote, terminological, end quote, or rather the general theoretical and scientific question, but involved the immediate political tasks and slogans of the party, the minority proposed a general party discussion. At and following the plenum, it was finally decided unanimously that the discussion would be divided into two parts, so to speak. One that could and would be conducted publicly in the New International, a discussion inaugurated by Trotsky's article on the Trotsky's article titled "The USSR in War," and which would be confined to the theoretical, quote, terminological, end quote, question of the class nature of the Soviet state. The other that would be conducted in the membership, and which would deal with the concrete political tradition and practice of the Bolshevik movement. Would deal with the concrete political questions. In this separation, the proposal of the minority was in accordance with the best tradition and practice of the Bolshevik movement. This proposal was unanimously adopted by the political committee. To date, it has been carried out only by the minority. But it is argued, while the minority may say that the minority does not propose a revision of the party's basic position on the Soviet Union, what assurance can the party have that next month or next year the minority or any of the minority spokesmen will not raise the question of reconsideration? On that score, no guarantees can be given by the minority or by any of the minority's members, nor should any be asked for, because those guarantees would be meaningless. Such guarantees cannot be given by the minority. Such guarantees may be developments. Such guarantees cannot be given by the Cannon Group or by anybody else. In this period, there may be developments in the Soviet Union, in the opinion of this or that comrade or group or of the entire international, have produced such a radical change in the situation as to demand a change in our programmatic position on the question of the class nature of the Soviet state. Such developments may be, for example, the supplementary proletarian revolution in Russia, or in the contrary case, a bourgeois counter-revolution, or looking retrospectively at the Soviet Union from a point many months or years removed from the present moment. The International may conclude that the present Stalinist bureaucracy was a new, independent ruling class as outlined hypothetically in the recent article by Trotsky. The minority does not propose a revision of the party's program on this question. It is not the question in dispute. If the Canon Group insists that it is the question, and that if no one else raises it for decision, it raises it in a motion to, quote, reaffirm the fundamental position of the party on the class nature of the Soviet state, end quote, then all comrades will vote on this question as they have in the past, namely according to their opinions and convictions, and there will still be left for discussion and decision the question that is really at issue. In its plenum resolution, the minority proposed, quote, a revision of our previous construct of, quote, the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, end quote. What was meant in the past by the Fourth Internationalists when the Fourth Internationalists advocated and spoke of the, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote? By, quote, unconditional, end quote, we simply meant that we do not demand as a condition for our defense of the Soviet Union the preliminary removal of the Stalinist bureaucracy. That is, we will defend the Soviet Union even if or in spite of its domination by the Stalin machine. In the same sense, revolutionists have always said that revolutionists defend trade unions in their struggles even when they are headed by conservatives or reactionaries. That did not mean that we defend it in Stalin's way. On the contrary, we have no faith in the bureaucracy, no confidence that the bureaucracy will lead the defense of the Soviet Union effectively along a consistent class line in a revolutionary manner. Yet, in our independent class way, with our revolutionary internationalist line, we defend the Soviet Union, quote, for the Stalinist regime, no. For the socialist fatherland, yes, end quote. Did that policy mean that we would support, quote, defend, end quote, every act of Stalinist diplomacy, every act of the Red Army, or the GPU, or the other armed forces of Stalin? Of course not. Comrade Lund, which again is Trotsky, is entirely wrong when he assumes that the minority represents the traditional policy of the Fourth International in any other way, thereby disorienting especially the young comrades in our movement as to what has been our conception in the past. Naturally, we did not in the past and do not today support the actions of the Red Army or the GPU in shooting down revolutionists in Russia or in Spain. Naturally, we would not support the actions of the Red Army if it were to suppress a proletarian revolution in the Soviet Union, the political revolution which we advocate. Naturally, we would not support the actions of the Red Army if it were to suppress an uprising of Ukrainian workers and peasants fighting for an independent Soviet Ukraine. In other words, our slogan of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, did not mean, nor does it mean today, that we defend the Stalinist bureaucracy or the Stalinist bureaucracy's Red Army in any war they conduct against the proletariat or against the revolution. On this score, there is no one who proposes a revision of our conception of our policy for the good and simple reason that no revision is needed. Our slogan did, however, mean that we are unconditionally for the defense of the Soviet Union in any war it conducts against a capitalist power. Our slogan did, however, mean that we are unconditionally for the defense of the Soviet Union in any war it conducts against a capitalist power. What basic conception motivated this clear and categorical position? The view that in a conflict with any capitalist country, the war on the part of the Red Army could only be progressive. That is, even under Stalin it would be defending in its own, i.e. bureaucratic way, the conquest of the October Revolution. This is how we understood matters in any war. Not, to be sure, a war against the Russian Bolshevik Leninists or the proletarian revolutionists in Spain, but a war with, quote, democratic England, fascist Germany, or even semi-colonial China. This is the position that the minority now proposes to revise. Such a revision is necessary because it has been revealed that the Soviet Union, that is the Stalinist bureaucracy and the Stalinist bureaucracy's army, is capable of carrying on not only progressive wars but also reactionary wars. More to the point, in the present dispute, the Stalinist bureaucracy has proved that it is capable of conducting a reactionary war even against bourgeois states. From this does not follow that we are defensists in the bourgeois states in question. Their war against the Soviet Union is not less reactionary, and we remain revolutionary defeatists under the slogan, quote, the main enemy is at home, end quote. But it does follow that we can no longer hold to our previous concept concept of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, in a war against a capitalist power or powers. At this point, the Cannon Group interjects, quote, your division of wars into progressive and reactionary, however correct it may be, leaves out of consideration precisely the criterion which we consider fundamental, namely the class character of the state which is conducting the war, end quote. The argument of the Cannon faction boils down to the ridiculous and unhistorical view that a capitalist state, because of its class nature, cannot ever fight a progressive war, and that a worker state, even a degenerated worker state, because of its class nature, cannot ever fight a reactionary war. This is the view of the mechanical-minded economic fetishist and not of revolutionary Marxists, for it is based upon the concept that in a war between, quote, nationalized economy and, quote, private economy, end quote, nationalized economy automatically assures that the nationalized economies for it is based upon the conception that in a war between, quote, nationalized economy and, quote, private economy, nationalized economy automatically assures nationalized economy's own progressivism, the war being waged by the nationalized economy. This mechanical conception is all the more, not less erroneous with reference to the Soviet Union. Writing on the difference between capitalist society and the Soviet Union, Trotsky says, quote, in general, the productive forces, upon a basis of private property and competition, have been working out their own destiny. In contrast to this, the property relations which issued from the socialist revolution are indivisibly bound up with the new state as their repository. The dominance of socialist over petty bourgeois tendencies is guaranteed by not by the automatism of economy, we are still far from that, but by political measures taken by the dictatorship. The character of the economy as a whole thus depends upon the character of the state power. The character of the economy as a whole thus depends upon the state power, end quote. Our emphasis. This entirely correct view applies with equal validity to the question of the war. The character of any war engaged in now by the Stalinist regime, quote, is guaranteed not by the automatism of economy, end quote, as the Cannon Group falsely contends, but, quote, depends, at least in large measure, upon the character of the state power, end quote. That is, the political regime of the ruling bureaucracy. It would, however, be just as erroneous to draw the mechanical conclusion that because this bureaucracy is reactionary and counter-revolutionary, it cannot ever conduct a progressive war, even more than the reactionary character of the Chiang Kai-shek regime predetermines the reactionary character of any war in which it engaged. The correct formula would be, the character of the war is determined by the predominant political and social aims of each of the belligerents and their enemy. The character of the war is determined by the predominant political and social aims of each of the belligerents and their enemy, and their objective consequences, and very often by the character of the regime which is conducting the war. Furthermore, particularly in our epoch, our attitude towards a given war must be based upon the interest of the international proletariat and of the world socialist revolution. Furthermore, particularly in our epoch, our attitude toward a given war must be based upon the interest of the international proletariat and of the world socialist revolution. From this basic standpoint, we must approach the question, what is the character of Russia's role in the present war? What is the character of Russia's role in the present war? Not the war as the war was foretold on this or that occasion, and not the war into which this one may or will be converted. Not the war into which this one may or will be converted, but the present war. Stalin is not conducting a war for the defense of nationalized property from an attack of imperialism, which aims to convert the Soviet Union into its colony. On the other side, the imperialists in this war are not fighting to divide the Soviet Union among themselves, but for a series of reasons largely beyond their control. They are conducting an inter-imperialist war at each other's own expense, with one camp seeking to keep the Soviet Union as its ally, and the other seeking to win it as its ally. In the present war, the Stalin regime plays the role of an agent of imperialism, facilitating the victory of the fascist bandits over the, quote, democratic bandits. In addition, It pursues, as we shall see later on, imperialistic aims of its own. It does not liberate, but rather enslaves and disenfranchises the people it conquers. It tramples cynically upon the democratic and socialist sentiments of the masses, and drives them into the arms of the reactionary bourgeoisie. It is pursuing predominantly reactionary aims. It is playing a predominantly reactionary role. In a word, it is conducting a reactionary war, and therefore the socialist proletariat cannot be for its defense. The urgent problems of the role played by the Soviet Union, read Stalin and his army, in the present war, are systematically avoided and evaded by the Cannon Group. To the question, are you for the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union? In the war it is carrying on now, the Cannon Group replies, we are for the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union in the war it will carry on tomorrow, the war into which the present war will inevitably be converted. In his letter of October 18, 1939, again and once more on the nature of the USSR, Comrade Trotsky writes, quote, in every case the Fourth International will know how to distinguish where and when the Red Army is acting solely as an instrument of the Bonapartist reaction, and where it defends the social basis of the USSR, end quote. Our emphasis. It is necessary to introduce into this sentence at least one amendment. In place of, quote, will know how to distinguish, end quote, will know how to distinguish, should be replaced with, quote, should be placed, quote, should know how to distinguish. Should know how to distinguish, end quote. Shit. Where am I? Okay, sorry, I accidentally skipped a page. If we make the most calculated effort to eliminate all factional and polemical sharpness, and look back upon the September weeks in the party leadership with the utmost possible objectivity, we come to the conclusion that the pact and Stalin's invasion of Poland caught the party, the Cannon Group particularly, unawares and left it tongue-tied during the whole crucial period, so that it presented no policy, gave no answers, and very obviously stalled for time. The minority has said a dozen times in writing and resolutions and speeches that it does not base its views on the mere fact that Stalin shifted from a, quote, democratic to a fascist ally. The Soviet Union is not engaged in a progressive war or defense of the remaining conquests of the Russian Revolution from imperialist attack, but rather as an integral part of reactionary imperialist war. It is the real war that followed that compels us to change our position. Let us see more concretely why this is so. How did we conceive specifically of the role of the Soviet Union in case of a war breaking out during the period of the Franco-Soviet Pact and of our position towards it? Hitler would be engaged in a war against the Soviet Union and at the same time against bourgeois France. If the Soviet Union were thus allied with one imperialist power against the other, our International declared that we would defend the Soviet Union without for a moment becoming defensist in the land of the imperialist ally. Concretely, the war between France and Germany would be a reactionary imperialist war on both sides. Hitler's war against the Soviet Union, however, would be aimed at conquering the Ukraine, dismembering the Union as a whole, restoring private property, etc., and the Stalin regime, willy-nilly, would be fighting a progressive war of defense from imperialist attack. We too would defend the Soviet Union, in our own way, of course. We would be its foremost and best soldiers and defenders. But the war presented us with a different picture when it finally broke out. And it is that war we must consider, unless, as Lenin once said, we are to be the kind of, quote, old Bolsheviks, end quote, who are, quote, meaninglessly repeating a formula learned by rote instead of studying the unique living reality, end quote. Instead of an attack upon the Soviet Union by imperialism, we had the outbreak of the inter-imperialist war between England, France, and Germany. Instead of Stalin, quote, helping Poland resist Hitler, as he had earlier urged England and France to allow him to do, or at least pretending to urge this, Stalin and Hitler divided Poland between them, after crushing it by preliminary agreement and in military and political collaboration. Now, in a general way, we predicted the possibility of a Hitler-Stalin pact, but we did not predict, as Trotsky pointed out in the Socialist Appeal of the 11th of September 1939, a military alliance with Hitler. Naturally, it is not a matter here of, quote, reproaching, end quote, our movement in general, or Comrade Trotsky in particular, for having failed to, quote, forecast or to, quote, predict every single event in all details. What is involved is the question of the character of the war that actually broke out and in which the Soviet Union is participating, regardless of what this war will or may become, or what this war will or may be converted into, Stalin is not defending the Soviet Union from imperialist attack. Stalin is carrying on a reactionary war of annexation in alliance with Hitler. Stalin is carrying on a reactionary war of annexation in alliance with Hitler. We'll leave aside for the moment the question of Stalinist imperialism, which is dealt with below. It is only in light of this reality that the conduct of the Cannon faction can be understood. The actual war caught it unawares because it was not expected. The majority could not reconcile itself to the fact that the invasion was being conducted jointly by Hitler and Stalin. It clung to the old prognosis that Hitler was marching to attack Stalin, instead of meeting him halfway through Poland to divide the spoils. God damn it. That's okay. Sorry about that. Goldman thought Stalin invaded Poland without Hitler's support. Therefore, he endorsed the invasion. Goldman learned what would have been clear to all from the beginning, what should have been clear to all from the beginning, that Stalin invaded Poland with Hitler's support. Therefore, Goldman withdraws his endorsement. And the majority, the Cannon faction did not vote for Goldman's motion to endorse the invasion, and it refused to condemn the invasion for the simple reason, as Cannon put it at that time, that it cannot yet be known whether Stalin's invasion occurred with or without Hitler's agreement. To put it differently, the Cannon group could not decide whether Stalin entered the war to defend the Soviet Union from imperialist attack, Hitler, or entered the war with annexationist aims in collaboration with imperialism. The Cannon group did not, quote, know how to distinguish where and when the Red Army is acting solely as an instrument of the Bonapartist reaction and where it defends the social basis of the USSR, end quote. The Cannon faction did not, quote, know how to distinguish where and when the Red Army is acting solely as an instrument of the Bonapartist reaction and where it defended the social basis of the USSR, end quote. Had Stalin invaded Poland without Hitler's blessing, Goldman, and presumably the Cannon faction as a whole, would approve the invasion. But in that case, what happens to the slogan in Trotsky's main article voted so firmly by the Cannon group at the plenum, namely, quote, "We were and remain against seizures of new territories by the Kremlin"? What does this slogan mean? Now, there cannot be any doubt that Stalin's invasion of Poland, like Stalin's subsequent invasion of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, has as its purpose the annexation of these countries. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland. Or Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland's transformation into military, quote, protectorates, end quote, which is tantamount to the same thing in the three Baltic countries. The Stalinists may claim that these invasions merely anticipate an imperialist attack on Russia, And the Stalinists may claim that these invasions merely anticipate an imperialist attack on Russia, and that these invasions are undertaken for the defense of the Soviet Union from imperialism. Whatever position the Cannon Group may take on this claim, the Cannon Group are nevertheless on record in opposition to the, quote, seizure of new territories by the Kremlin, end quote, to, quote, annexations, end quote. How then can Goldman or the Cannon faction in general, quote, approve, end quote, the invasion, provided the invasion is, quote, not as a result of the agreement with Hitler, end quote, and at the same time oppose the annexation? Evidently on the basis of opposing the annexation only after it has been accomplished, after Stalin has annexed the, quote, new territories, end quote. We call upon the masses to fight against the annexation, for the right of self-determination, for separation, presumably also. We call upon the Russian masses to help the people of the new territories in this fight. But before the annexation of the new territories, according to the Cannon Group, we call upon their population to fight for the defense of the Soviet Union. We support the invasion, which aims at annexing the new territories, and we call upon the Soviet workers to give Stalin's army morale and material assistance in the invasion. We shall see where this preposterous line leads us in the case of Finland. In less than 2 weeks, the Cannon faction, which prides itself on the firmness of the Cannon faction's basic position, has presented the Socialist Workers' Party with no less than 2 documented positions on the invasion of Finland, with 2.5 positions if one adds the latest contribution to the discussion by Goldman. The first position was contained in the Appeal editorial on December 1st, 1939. In no sense was this editorial the product of Comrade Morrow alone. It was edited and approved jointly by a number of leaders of the Cannon faction. This editorial in the Appeal, this editorial's characterization of Stalin's invasion leaves nothing to be desired. Quote, that the Kremlin military intervention serves only the interests of the Kremlin and the Kremlin's imperialist ally, Hitler and Poland, that is carried out without consideration of the will and the feelings of the workers of the Soviet Union, or the occupied territories of the international proletariat, that it compromises the Soviet Union and disorients the world working class. These are our criticisms, end quote, end quote. If these words are not meant as a literary flourish, but as a political analysis of the war, they are equivalent to the declaration, the invasion is reactionary in every respect. It serves, quote, only, end quote, the interests of the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy of Hitler. Only those interests. That is the analysis. And the logical conclusion, quote, if a struggle breaks out between bourgeois Finland and the Soviet Union, it is the duty of the Finnish workers to be Soviet partisans in that struggle, end quote. In the war between Finland and the Soviet Union, Stalin and the Red Army pursue only reactionary aims and serve only reactionary interests. Therefore, the Finnish workers must support the Red Army in the invasion. I'll repeat that again. In the war between Finland and the Soviet Union, Stalin and the Red Army pursue only reactionary aims and only serve reactionary interests. Therefore, the Finnish workers must support the Red Army in the invasion! Exclamation point. This is the mumbo-jumbo to which we have been brought by the slogan of, quote, unconditional defense, end quote. And this mumbo-jumbo is sanctified in the eyes of this mumbo-jumbo's authors by the fact that these authors make the sign of the cross before the formula. Russia is a worker state. It is with such a position that the Cannon faction believes that it will be able to combat the wave of chauvinist hysteria, which the imperialists and Democrats and social democrats are cleverly creating among the masses over, quote, poor little Finland, end quote. It is a policy capable only of repelling workers, not the worst but the best, and of driving them closer into the arms of bourgeois patriotism. How thoroughly untenable this position was, to say nothing of the reaction of the party membership, may be judged from the fact that even the Cannon group found it necessary to beat a retreat conducted in its own characteristic way. The state of policy of the PC appeal, December 9th, 1939, was first presented to the meeting of the committee without a word of explanation or justification. Not one word was said about the relation of this statement to the line of the editorial of December 1st, whether the lines coincided or conflicted. It was only on the insistent and formally recorded questioning of the minority that 3 out of 4 Cannonite spokesmen replied, quote, "This editorial, while the general line of it is more or less correct, is too loosely written to be considered a party position. The section which speaks of the Finnish workers as Soviet partisans is incorrect in its formulation. The statement which we have just adopted corrects the editorial and is to be considered the party line on the question," end quote. But how is the average party, or it's probably YPSL, which I believe is the Young Persons Socialist League, can't be sure, member, who does not see the minutes of the PC, to know what the first editorial on the not unimportant question of Finland was, quote, loosely written, end quote. That the much commented on and much disputed phrase about the Finnish workers being Soviet partisans is, quote, incorrect, end quote, and does not correspond to the official party line. So far as he knows, he must still defend the policy of the first editorial as the party position, and moreover he must defend it as an honorary with the second editorial, which, quote, is to be considered the party line on the question, end quote. Considered such by whom? Who knows about it? What party member or YPSL member? What reader of the appeal? How are they to know about it? The party leadership does not deign to inform the membership or the appeal readers that the slogan of the Finnish workers, quote, "Be Soviet partisans in this invasion," end quote, is, quote, incorrect, end quote, now. It refuses to give any indication that it is, quote, incorrect, end quote, in the party press. Such an indication might reflect somewhat on the carefully guarded prestige of the party leadership, that is, the Cannon faction. To all intents and purposes, therefore, and particularly so far as the members of the appeal are concerned, the facts will be learned by the membership only by reading the present statement. The Socialist Workers' Party position on the Finnish invasion is represented by the December 1st statement, which is, quote, incorrect, end quote, and also by the December 9th statement, which is, quote, correct. As to the fact that our enemies cunningly exploit the first editorial for their own reactionary ends, that is only another trifle compared with the considerations of bureaucratic prestige politics. Just what, however, and how much does the second position correct in the first position? The December 9th statement characterizes the Stalinist party in Finland as follows, quote, "The protection of the interest and privileges of the bureaucracy in utter disregard of the sentiments and interest of the world proletariat," end quote. The characterization of the December 1st edition is more exact and ample by far, but let us for the moment accept the second version. What follows from it, quote, "In the present military struggle, a victory of the Red Army is a, quote, lesser evil," end quote, than the victory of the army of the Finnish puppet government of Wall Street and London, end quote. What is the concrete meaning of this conception of the, quote, lesser evil, end quote, in Finland? Question mark. In the first place, it means that there is no other choice facing the Finnish proletariat but these: either the victory of the Finnish bourgeoisie and the Finnish bourgeoisie's army, or the victory of the Red Army. Since the revolutionary proletariat of Finland is too weak, unorganized, demoralized to fight for its independent Soviet power now, and since it is inadmissible in principle for it to support the Finnish bourgeoisie, quote, "a victory of the Red Army is a, quote, lesser evil," end quote, end quote. In that case, the slogan of the December 1st editorial, quote, "Finnish workers to be Soviet partisans," end quote, far from being, quote, loosely written, end quote, is absolutely exact. Far from being, quote, incorrect, end quote, is absolutely correct. Why then does the Cannon Group now repudiate the slogan? If, quote, a victory of the Red Army is a, quote, lesser evil, end quote, then the Finnish workers must be Soviet partisans. What species of political cowardice dictated the omission of this slogan from the December 9th editorial? Paragraph, quote, C, dealing with the tasks of the Fourth Internationalists in the Soviet Union, calls for, quote, unceasing criticism and exposure of the Stalinist methods of starting and conducting the war, but not the slightest relaxation of material and military support, end quote. Good. Stalin's invasion of Finland is reactionary. Stalin's invasion of Finland serves only the interests of the counter-revolutionary Bonapartist clique and of Hitler. Stalin's invasion of Finland's aim is the, quote, protection of the interest and privileges of the bureaucracy, end quote. And for those reasons, the Russian workers and revolutionists must not relax in the slightest their material and military support to Stalin's invasion of Finland. But why only the Russian workers? Why aren't the Finns, and for that matter the Americans, called upon to give the same material and military support to the Red Army? In the Spanish Civil War, we rightly regarded the victory of the People's Front regime, bourgeois democracy, as the, quote, lesser evil, end quote, compared to the victory of Franco. Fascism. Quote, everywhere and always, where and when revolutionary workers are not powerful enough to immediately overthrow the bourgeois regime, they defend from fascism even the rotten bourgeois democracy, and especially do they defend from fascism their own positions inside a bourgeois democracy, end quote. Trotsky. Bourgeois democracy was conducting a progressive war against fascism. We were open, unashamed defensists in the former camp and defeatists in the latter. We said openly, for the victory of the Loyalist army, for the defeat of Franco's army. Moreover, we were military defeatists in the Franco camp. We called upon the workers and peasants and soldiers in the Franco camp to sabotage his war, to desert to the Loyalist side, to facilitate the victory of the Loyalist army. What else can be seriously meant by, quote, defensism? In both camps, we called for material and military aid to one camp. In both camps, we called for military and material aid to one camp, namely the Loyalist. Why doesn't the Cannon Group say the same thing plainly about Finland? There was nothing mealy-mouthed about our position on Spain. The same cannot be said for the position of the Cannon Group today. It is shame-faced defensism. The December 16th editorial in the Appeal seeks to, quote, popularize, end quote, the Cannon line. This is attempted by means of the much-abused comparison between the Stalinized Soviet Union and a bureaucratized trade union. The Cannon faction, which is, quote, principled, end quote, which is under no democratic or patriotic pressure, and which stuffs the minds of the party members with the, quote, simple, end quote, trade union analogy in place of a concrete political analysis, ought to speak out flatly. The Finnish workers must facilitate the victory of the Red Army. The Red Army is the, quote, lesser evil. The Finnish workers must give the Red Army material and military aid. The Finnish workers must... The Finnish workers must be Soviet Red Army partisans. As such, the Finnish workers must make a united front with the Kuusinen regime and the Finnish CP in order to speed the victory of the, quote, lesser evil, end quote. The Finnish workers, especially the Finnish Revolutionary Vanguard, must retain their organizational and political independence, to be sure, but as an independent force they must make a united front with the Stalinists of Russia and Finland in the same way as we made a united front with Stalinists, Social Democrats and anarchists in Spain, in order to speed the victory of the Loyalist army. That would not be the present shame-faced defensism of the Cannonites, but genuine defensism as we preached and practiced it in Spain. The final twist to the canon line is given, as usual, without authorization or responsibility by Goldman. Goldman advocates now nothing more and nothing less than the slogan of the withdrawal of all Soviet troops from Finnish soil. On what conceivable basis can the Cannon Group or any of the Cannon Group's spokesmen give the Cannon Group's political line, given the Cannon Group's political line, put forward the slogan of peace and the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Finnish soil? What then happens to the, quote, lesser evil, end quote? Again, when Lenin advanced the slogan of peace in 1918, Lenin was part of the government of Soviet Russia. Lenin was not seeking to arouse the masses against that government. What would be the Goldman slogan of peace, of withdrawal of troops from Finland? What would the Goldman slogan of peace, of withdrawal of troops from Finland, mean now in the Soviet Union? Presumably the slogan is put forward as one to be raised by our comrades in the Soviet Union. But they are an anti-government party. They would have to raise that slogan against the government, the Stalin regime, against its policies, against its conduct of the war, and those who support it. Quote, "We are not a governmental party. We are the party of irreconcilable opposition, not only in capitalist countries, but also in the USSR. Our task among them, the, quote, defense of the USSR, our tasks among them, the, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, we realize not through the medium of bourgeois governments and even through the government of the USSR, but exclusively through the education of the masses, through agitation, through explaining to the workers what they should defend and what they should overthrow," end quote. Trotsky, The USSR and War. In that case, the slogan of peace in the Soviet Union is the concrete slogan of revolutionary defeatism. Quote, "The experience of the years 1914 to 18, end quote, says our theses on the war and the Fourth International, quote, demonstrates at the same time that the slogan of peace is in no way contradictory to the strategic formula of, quote, defeatism, end quote. On the contrary, the slogan of peace develops a tremendous revolutionary force, especially in the case of a protracted war," end quote. That is why the minority canon does advocate that slogan. That is why the Cannonites voted down the slogan Goldman said was, quote, implicit in their position, which did not prevent Morrow, another Cannonite, from advocating it publicly at a party mass meeting. Anything goes once you swear by the quote, fundamentals, end quote. The slogan could not be adopted by the Cannon faction for the simple reason that its line boils down politically to trailing behind Stalinism in the best case and capitulation to Stalinism in the worst. The line of the Cannon Group as a whole and of the Cannon Group's individual spokesmen singly demonstrates in practice that once you consent to swear solemnly and regularly that Russia is a worker state, you are thenceforth permitted the most liberal experimentation with slogans and policies of the day, and at the same time you acquire the right to accuse the minority of, quote, improvisation, end quote. The position of the minority on the invasion of Finland can be stated very simply. To the Finnish worker, we must say, your main fight is against your own bourgeoisie and the imperialists whose pawn it is. You are not fighting for the independence of Finland, for its sovereign integrity, but for the bankers and bandits of London, Paris, and Washington. We know why you are fighting with such vehemence against the Stalinist forces. We understand fully your sentiments, for we know only too well that what a victory of Stalinism would mean to you, the same slavery and oppression that your Russian brothers now endure. But do not react to the threat of Stalinist enslavement with such unthinking bitterness that you become blind cannon fodder of your main enemy, your class enemy. We know that Stalin aims to annex Finland for his own power, prestige, and privilege. You must resist that. You must crack every dirty Stalinist finger that is outstretched now to enslave you. You have a right to a free and independent Finland, but you cannot conduct, much less win that fight as tools of Mannerheim under the domination of your bourgeoisie. First things come first, and your first job is to crush your ruling class, win over the army, or create your own. Establish your own power, which will not be a tool of imperialism or the bankers and landlords, but in which you can have full confidence. Then you will be able to resist the Stalinist invader. We cannot tell you, we Fourth Internationalists, to give military and material aid to the Red Army, now fighting a reactionary war. For the Red Army's victory means annexation of Finland by Stalin and its subjection to the counter-revolutionary Kremlin. The day after that happened, we would have to tell you again to fight for your freedom, against annexation, against the Red Army which maintains it, on which the class struggle regardless of the results on the military front. Perhaps you will not win this time, but in the course of the war the Finnish bourgeois regime will collapse, as did the Polish regime, and your chance will come then. Then be doubly careful, for the Red Army will act as agents of the counter-revolution in the Kremlin, trying to cheat you out of the fruits of your struggle. Seek also, therefore, to win over the Russian worker and peasant in uniform, fraternize with them, help establish mutual and comradely understanding, and when the day comes that you have the strength, strike against your oppressors. To the Russian worker, we must say, Stalin is conducting a reactionary war, which discredits and disgraces the Soviet Union and the working class movement. That war is conducted only in the interests of the bureaucracy. It serves only the Kremlin gang and Hitler. It is not your war. Stalin wants to annex Finland and deprive Finland's people of the right of self-determination. What interest can you have in that? You want peace. You want an end to the rule of bureaucratic assassins who abuse and degrade you in the name of, quote, socialism. If Stalin were really defending the Soviet Union from imperialist attack, we would have to clench our teeth and help him all we could, settling accounts with him later. But this war is reactionary, and we should not give him an ounce of political or material or military support. Does that mean you must shoot your officer tomorrow? Does that mean you refuse to fight? Does that mean you take Mannerheim's help against the Stalinists? Nothing of the kind. A thinking worker is not a putschist, an adventurist, or an individualist. Although we are too weak for anything like that now, let us use this occasion to educate our comrades in the army and back home, to tell them the truth, to organize secret calls prudently to promote every movement of mass discontent against the perfidious regime, prudently to advocate fraternization with our Finnish brothers and the speediest calling off of this rotten war. We had nothing to do with the calling of this war, secretly planned by the bureaucracy in cahoots with Hitler. We must continue and expand our struggle against the Stalinist bureaucracy, regardless of the results on the military front. With such a policy, no tremendous successes will be achieved overnight on either side of the front. It, quote, cannot give immediate miraculous results, end quote. It is entirely in place to quote Trotsky here, quote, but we do not even pretend to be miracle workers. As things stand, we are a revolutionary minority. Our work must be directed so that the workers on whom we have influence, end quote, even should they at first number no more than 2 or 3, quote, should correctly appraise events, not permit themselves to be caught unawares, and prepare the general sentiment of their own class for the revolutionary solution of the tasks confronting us. End quote. Trotsky, the USSR in war. But what if the Red Army should win before the Finnish workers can make their own revolution, as is the more likely variant? And what if the Stalinists, for reasons of their own, should nationalize industry or the land or establish, quote, Soviets? We would still follow substantially the same policy towards the Stalinists. We would say to the Finnish workers, we must start now from the new situation. The old capitalists have been driven out, but the nationalization of industry and land can become really progressive only if you have workers' control and management of the plants, only if you drive the Kremlin commissars out of the factories and the land, only if you drive them out of the fake Soviets, or rather set up genuinely democratic Soviets in their place. Only if you fight for separation from the Soviet Union, for the right of self-determination. No aid to Stalinism while it fastens the yoke on your necks. No aid to Stalinism while you are unfastening that yoke. It's interesting that this is the first time in reading all this, in like the fate of the Russian Revolution. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure in all of my reading thus far, I'm on page, 500 or something. Like 550. think 556 is actually right. This is the first time I'm seeing the word work. I'm seeing anything about workers' control or management of plants. Obviously, the bureaucratic collectivists, or the main thing is that the content of a state that nationalizes property is dictated by who controls that state, right? So clearly they want workers' control of the state, but I have not really seen any. I don't think I've seen anything thus far in this entire book about workers' control in terms of like a more localized level of industry and plant. Granted, this is a pretty early piece too. This is from the late 1930s. I think it's 1939 is when this piece is coming out. Maybe I'm listen to what I said at the beginning of the video because I was looking at the actual date of the thing then, but that's interesting. Especially I think this is especially important when you're talking about the differences between bureaucratic collectivist theories of the USSR and state capitalist theories. This is going to be like the big one, at least within the groups that emerge out of Trotskyism, right? Some form of workers' control of industry, both local and nationally, and hopefully internationally. Control of the labor process becomes more and more of an important thing, and more an important factor in deciding whether or not the USSR is capitalist, at least for a lot of the early capitalists. It's less so about like money and other like value criteria like that, but more about like how is like production arranged on the local level in Soviet plants. Since they're radically hierarchical and authoritarian and exploitative and try to curtail free time as well as consumption to the utmost without any democratic input from the workers themselves, much less control by the workers themselves, or management by the workers themselves, then these are state capitalist societies. Which is like important. I think it's also important to note that like the state capitalist people are saying that like that something radically different has taken place in the Soviet Union as well, even though obviously they think it's capitalist in a certain sense. Obviously, they use the name state capitalist, but they aren't like saying that a capitalist restoration has taken place, right? They're not saying that like private capitalism has returned to the Soviet Union. What is returned is a state capitalism, right? They're not just saying capitalism's come back, but a new kind of capitalism is in the saddle. But anyway, there's just a thought that I had. The first thing, there's just a thought I had to myself. Marginalia. But we are asked finally, suppose the imperialists, using the Finnish invasion as a pretext, launch a real attack upon the Soviet Union with the aim of carving the Soviet Union up among themselves, of restoring capitalism, of smashing not only Stalinism, but everything that remains of what we fought for 22 years to maintain. Will you then be for the defense of the Soviet Union? To which we answer simply, yes. Will you then be for the defense of the Soviet Union? To which we answer simply, yes. If the character of the war really changes into a war of imperialist attack upon the Soviet Union, we shall take a clear-cut position of defensism, not the shamefaced defensism of the Canaanites in the present war, but unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. So we acted in Spain. So we would act in the Soviet Union. Our slogan is, defense of the Soviet Union in any progressive war. The Cannon Group would like to dismiss such questions as the invasion of Poland with the epithet, quote, an incident, or, quote, an episode, end quote, in the preparations for the imperialist war against Russia, which is coming. How many more such, quote, episodes are required before they cease being mere, quote, episodes? First Poland, then Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, now Finland. First Poland, then Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, now Poland. Tomorrow and the day after somewhere else. Then the minority stands for the position of defeatism, cries the Canon group. One is either a defensist, at least a half-hearted one as we are, or one is a defeatist. To which we reply, in the present war we have made it quite clear that we are not defensist. Rather, we adopt a form of defeatism. In the present conflict, the Stalinist bureaucracy and its army are conducting a reactionary war. The Stalinist bureaucracy and its army do not represent the interests of the world proletariat or the socialist revolution or the Soviet Union. The Stalinist bureaucracy and its army represent the interests on the one hand of German imperialism and on the other the counter-revolutionary anti-Soviet bureaucracy. In the present war, these interests are reactionary. Quote, the economic transformations in the occupied provinces, end quote, writes Trotsky, and quite rightly, quote, do not compensate for this by even a 10th part, end quote. We do not support this war any more than we would, quote, support such a shameful strike, end quote, as one organized, quote, against the admission of Negroes into a certain branch of industry, end quote. Trotsky. If we do not support it, we oppose it. What form does our opposition take? Revolutionary defeatism. That means the continuation and intensification of the revolutionary struggle against the Stalinist regime and for its overthrow, regardless of the effects on the military front. Does this mean an alliance with the Finnish bourgeoisie? Does this mean the victory of the Finnish army? Nothing of the sort. In a war that is reactionary on both sides, our slogans are not national but international. The Finnish proletariat must defeat its own bourgeoisie and the Finnish proletariat's army. The Soviet proletariat must overthrow the Stalinist bureaucracy and the Soviet proletariat's army. Quote, but the war is on now, which way shall the workers in the Red Army shoot, end quote. The Canaanites asked this question of us with an air of triumph. We are not putschists or anarchists. We do not believe that the armed uprising can be called into existence by mere will of the small vanguard. We do not believe that the actions of individuals can be substituted for the actions of the vanguard, or those of the vanguard for those of the class as a whole. It is not at all a question of what this or that worker or little group of workers should do, quote, with his rifle, end quote. Until the vanguard has been brought together in an ideologically and organizationally distinct and powerful force, until it has acquired mass support, the question of a decisive action remains a perspective. That is, the propaganda slogan has not yet developed into a slogan of action. The propaganda slogan has not yet developed into a slogan of action. The whole question, however, is how to realize this perspective, what steps to take, what line to follow in order to facilitate the progress of the vanguard. The argument, if there were an independent revolutionary movement already in existence, we would support it. But since there is not, we support the Stalinist invasion as the, quote, lesser evil, is essentially reactionary. The point is precisely this. The independent revolutionary movement cannot be brought into existence and advance if we support the Stalinist invasion. The forces of the third camp are already at hand. The forces of the third camp are already at hand, scattered, demoralized, without program or perspective. The problem is to bring the forces of the third camp together, to infuse the forces of the third camp with morale, to support the forces of the third camp with a program and perspective, to argue that these forces are small and insignificant, has no political meaning, for the argument could apply both ways. If they are significant, they can no more, quote, defend than they can, quote, defeat. Political meaning is contained only in the line upon which we expect the vanguard to come together and along which we urge them to act. That is the meaning of the section of the minority resolution on the war in Finland, which declares that we must take into account, quote, the military situation, the mood of the masses, and also the differing economic relations in Finland and Russia, end quote. The concrete moment when a propaganda slogan can be turned effectively into a slogan of action often depends upon the shifts in the military fronts. This has been observed in virtually every country where a revolutionary situation has developed. notably in the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the German and Austrian revolutions a year later. An army that records nothing but crushing victories is rarely inclined to listen to slogans calling for the overthrow of the regime that commands it. Again, the concrete tactical forms of the slogan aimed at reaching a given strategical goal will always differ from the change in the moods of the masses, which are in turn affected by a whole series of objective factors. To have a strategical objective is decisively important, but not enough. It is necessary also to be able to translate this objective into specific slogans suitable for every conjuncture. From this alone follows the absurdity of the question, quote, "What should they do now with their rifles?" End quote. Quote, "They," end quote, "will do what the soldiers in every army must do, namely obey the orders of their all-powerful officer command until such a time when the officer command is not all-powerful." Obey the orders of their all-powerful officer command until such a time when the officer command is not all-powerful. That is, when the masses are strong and conscious enough to refuse to obey their officers. Again, the whole problem is, what political line shall we adopt in order most speedily to reach that time in the struggle? Finally, our resolution pointed out the need of taking into account the different economic relations in the two countries. In other words, while the proletarian revolution in Finland will have the task of nationalizing industry by expropriating the bourgeoisie, the revolution in the Soviet Union will merely free the already nationalized property from the reactionary stranglehold of the parasitic bureaucracy. The line of the Cannon Group means that the third camp, however embryonic, must resign itself, quote, "for the present," end quote, to the victory of the Stalinist reaction. This is equivalent to a political capitulation to the Kremlin bureaucracy. The line of the minority means that the third camp, however embryonic or weak, must orient itself at the very outset towards a decisive struggle, not only against world imperialism, but also against the Stalinist reaction. An indispensable part of the preparation for this decisive struggle is the struggle against the Stalinist clique in the present war, for the peace slogan, for fraternization on the war front, for re-establishing the genuine Soviets in which the workers and peasants themselves can decide the questions of war and peace, for the conquest of the Red Army, for the overturn of the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, etc. Quote, "We often seek salvation from unfamiliar phenomenon in Quote, "We often seek salvation from unfamiliar phenomena in familiar terms," end quote, Trotsky once wrote. And naturally so. Our epoch is so rich in new phenomena, and the social-political lexicon is so limited, that we frequently characterize the new phenomena in terms of similar, even if not identical phenomena of the past. Terminological, quote, "experimentation," end quote, while often risky and at times pointless, is sometimes the only way of illuminating, by analogy, a new phenomenon, or an old phenomenon in new forms, and of relating it, with the necessary changes, to phenomena with which we are already familiar. Let us see if, in this sense, it is permissible to speak of a Stalinist imperialism, or to speak of Stalinist imperialism. The fact that all varieties of Menshevik, liberal, and bourgeois politicians speak, and have spoken for 20 years of, quote, "red imperialism," end quote, is not in itself an argument against the employment of the term, quote, "imperialism" to describe the present foreign policy of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Almost from the beginning of the Russian Revolution, the Mensheviks declared that what had triumphed in November 1917 was not the proletarian revolution, but the Thermidorian counter-revolution. What the increasing restrictions on Soviet democracy and the growth during the Civil War of the Red Army, the Mensheviks and social revolutionists even spoke of the triumph of Bonapartism in Russia, giving very learned and very stupid comparisons between the evolution of the Russian proletarian and the French bourgeois revolutions. In one of his first polemics against the ruling faction in Russia, the New Course, Trotsky argued that the attempt to make a comparison between the French and Russian revolutions was untenable. Quote, "The historical analogies of the Great French Revolution, the fall of the Jacobins, which liberalism and Menshevism established, and with which they console themselves," end quote, he wrote in 1923, quote, "are superficial and inconsistent," end quote, and so they were and remain in our opinion. That did not, as a side note, there's a difference between early Trotsky and later Trotsky, I believe, based upon what I've read from Baruch Knai Paz. Basically, like, he didn't believe that analogies to the French Revolution were useful, but he eventually did so, right? He definitely eventually did use words like thermidor and so on. Anyway, back to the text. But that did not for one moment prevent our own movement several years later from making legitimate comparisons from which legitimate conclusions were drawn, allowing for the necessary changes. We threw considerable light on the evolution of the Soviet regime by the analogy with the French thermidor of more than a century ago. Okay, see? I know what I'm talking about. Polemicizing against our use of the term, quote, imperialism, end quote, Trotsky now writes that in 1920, quote, the Mensheviks at that time already spoke of Bolshevik imperialism as borrowed from the tradition of czarist diplomacy. The petty bourgeois democracy willingly resorts to this argument even now. We have no reason, I repeat, for imitating them in this, end quote. There is no doubt that the same argument was made in its time to the use of the term, quote, Soviet thermidor, end quote. In fact, the official polemics against the left opposition in Russia of 10 to 12 years ago contained precisely this objection. Again, on the employment of the term, quote, Bonapartism, end quote, to characterize the Stalinist regime. The fact that all varieties of anti-Marxists had, and still do, use this term, did not deter us from using this term, Bonapartism, with the necessary qualifications to indicate the limits of the analogy. Even though there was no lack of objection in our own ranks when Trotsky first formulated the characterization. Quote, the matter is complicated, end quote, Trotsky wrote early in 1935. Quote, when we apply the term Bonapartism to the Stalin regime and speak of quote, Soviet Bonapartism, end quote. Quote, no, end quote, exclaim our critics. Quote, your Bonapartisms are too many. The term is becoming impermissibly extensive, ... end quote, etc. Such abstract, formal, verbal objections are usually made when there is nothing to say about the essential. Incontestably, neither Marx, Engels, nor Lenin applied the term Bonapartism to the workers' state. No wonder they had no occasion to. That Lenin did not hesitate to apply terms of the bourgeois regime to the workers' state with the necessary limitations is proved, for example, by his expression, quote, Soviet state capitalism, end quote. What is to be done, however, in those cases where the good old books do not give the necessary indications? In such cases, you have to rely on your own common sense, end quote. Trotsky's conclusion? Bonapartism is the, quote, scientific sociological definition, end quote, of the Stalin regime. Again, although Confucianists of all sorts speak glibly of the similarity between Russia and Germany, Trotsky in The Revolution Betrayed declares, quote, Stalinism and fascism, in spite of a deep difference in social foundations, are symmetrical phenomena, end quote. It will be argued that in all these comparisons and analogies, the essential differences are also indicated. Quite right. This only means that if we speak of Stalinist imperialism, it is necessary to point out wherein it differs from British or French or American or German imperialism, that is, from modern capitalist imperialism. For some time now, the Fourth International has characterized the Stalin regime as a, quote, agent of imperialism, end quote. That is correct. Up to yesterday, it was an agency of French imperialism. With its new alliance, it is an agency of German imperialism, and in general, the Stalinist bureaucracy is the agency through which world imperialism oppresses the Soviet proletariat and peasantry. In this respect, the minority has no different appreciation of the position of Stalinism than does Comrade Trotsky. Furthermore, we reject the view that it is impermissible for a worker state to maneuver among the imperialist powers, and even to make a bloc with one against another. But there is a fundamental difference between the, quote, blocs made by Lenin and the, quote, blocs made by Stalin. In utilizing the contradictions in the imperialist camp, Lenin did not thereby become a tool of imperialism. Stalin, representing a counter-revolutionary government, does act as an agent of imperialism, but this, quote, agent of imperialism, end quote, is not at all like such an agent of imperialism as, let us say, the comprador national bourgeoisie of China. It not only rests on a different economic foundation with contradictions and problems peculiar to it, but it also has different ambitions, appetites, national and international aims. It is not merely an agent of imperialism. It follows or tries to follow an imperialist policy of its own. In discussion with a Chinese comrade, the following statements occur. Quote, Crux, which again is Crux's Trotsky's pseudonym. Quote, Crux, a military... so I guess this quote's from Trotsky. A military alliance against Japan would in any case be preferable for China, even with the Soviet bureaucracy as it is. But then we must say that we demand that the Soviet Union delivers munitions, arms for the workers and peasants. Special committees must be created in Shanghai and workers' centers. The treaty must be elaborated with the participation not only of the Kuomintang, but also with the workers' and peasants' organizations. We ask for an open proclamation from the Soviet bureaucracy that at the end of the war no part of China would be occupied without the consent of the Chinese people, etc. End quote. Lee. End quote. Quote, Lee. Who's Lee? One second. Doesn't really seem to say anything about who Lee is. Lee, do you then think that the Soviet Union could be capable of conducting an imperialist policy? End quote. Well, I guess I shouldn't say end quote. This is a conversation. Crux, who again is Trotsky. If it is capable of organizing frame-ups, killing the revolutionaries, it is capable of all possible crimes. End quote. Trotsky. Internal Bulletin, December 1937. The Stalinist bureaucracy is capable of conducting an imperialistic policy. This concept and expression was first used in the Fourth International, not by the minority, which is, quote, imitating the petty bourgeois democracy, end quote, but by Comrade Crux, Trotsky. Does this mean that Stalinist imperialism stands on the same level with French or German imperialism? Not at all. Does the use of such a characterization for the Stalinist regime violate the conceptions of Marxism? Not at all. It is quite true that we have generally used the term, quote, imperialism, end quote, to describe modern imperialism, that is, the expansionist policy of capitalism in its last stage of monopolistic finance capital. But Marxists have pointed out time and again that imperialist policy has characterized regimes and societies other than that of finance capitalism, and that each was distinguished from the others by properties peculiar to it. There is no doctrine of Marxism that prevents us from speaking of a, quote, counter-revolutionary workers' state, end quote, or of, quote, Soviet Bonapartism, end quote. There is no doctrine of Marxism that prevents us from speaking of an imperialist policy peculiar to the Stalinist regime, which has reached an unprecedented depth of degeneration, unforeseen by Marx or by Lenin. Trotsky himself writes, quote, the driving force behind the Moscow bureaucracy is indubitably the tendency to expand the Moscow bureaucracy's power, the Moscow bureaucracy's prestige, the Moscow bureaucracy's revenue. This is the element of, quote, imperialism, end quote, in the widest sense of the word, which was a property in the past of all monarchies, oligarchies, ruling caste, medieval estates, and classes. However, in contemporary literature, at least Marxist literature, imperialism is understood to mean the expansionist policy of finance capital, which it has a very sharply defined economic content. However, in contemporary Marxist literature, at least Marxist literature, imperialism is understood to mean the expansionist policy of finance capital, which is a very sharply defined economic content, end quote. Trotsky. Just as a side note, this account of imperialism or European colonialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the notion that it's a um, the Leninist conception of the expansion of like foreign investment or whatever in like the third world to exploit it is something that very much came into question, has been very much questioned. For instance, Michael Heinrich notes that large lots of capital was exported across national borders in the early 20th century, at the time Lenin was writing, but most of that exportation of capital went to other countries that would more or less be labeled imperialist, right? The extension of, the investment of capital, say, from Germany to England, or England to Germany, or Germany to Russia, and vice versa, as opposed to like being invested in what we might call today the global South. And I think even today, I'm not exactly sure. I'm not an expert on economics, and especially not economic history, and especially not recent economic history. But I do believe that the United States, which is often called like the leading imperialist power, is a net importer of capital, as opposed to an exporter of capital. Again, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe that might be talking about my ass there, but I don't think that I am. Also, yeah. It also seems to me, this is just another thing, but it doesn't seem like you need a particularly like rigorous empirical understanding of like historical, what I guess the word is. It just kind of seems like a no-brainer to me that if you're trying to augment surplus value or augment profit, as it's, or augment interest, or any of the augment the surplus on initial investment, you don't need some kind of like particularly like grand theory about why that's like not possible at home. It seems like all you need to say is that capitalists in investing capital and deciding where money is to go, where investment is to be made, depends strictly on like what is most profitable. It doesn't seem like you need like at least this is seems like what makes sense to me. It doesn't seem like you need a particularly sophisticated explanation about, like why overproduction at home or something like that makes localized investment impossible or something like that, or like undesirable or something of that sort. All you need to say is that there's investment opportunities abroad, and those investments seek state protection. As like I don't know. I'm not really I'm not an expert on the history of world capital investment, but I'm just thinking some thoughts out loud. The first sentences of this quotation allow theoretically for the employment of the term, quote, imperialism, end quote, quote, in the widest sense of the word, end quote, to the Stalinist bureaucracy. As for the last sentence quoted, one can only reply that in contemporary Marxist literature, Bonapartism, for example, was limited to the scientific sociological definition of the ruling bourgeoisie at a certain stage in its development. Its extension to cover the Stalinist regime with the necessary qualifications was in no way an offense against Marxism. Similarly, in the case of the term, quote, imperialism, end quote. But what is the nature of Stalinist imperialism? What are the necessary qualifications that must be borne in mind in employing this terminology? And above all, this question is the most justified: what is the economic basis of this imperialism? It would, of course, be absurd to identify it with the imperialism that prevails in the modern capitalist world. Monopolistic finance capital does not dominate the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union exports very little in commodities and even less in capital. sorry, I'm just thinking about how, like, usually the Trotskyist defense, or like the Trotsky's defense of the Soviet Union as a worker state, in addition to nationalized property and the institution of planning mechanisms to replace market mechanisms, was the monopoly of foreign trade. And to my understanding, like, foreign trade was fairly important in the Soviet Union in order to gain access to sophisticated industrial goods. But again, if someone questions that, I mean, I'm not really in the position to, like, give an elaborate account of why that is, but it seems like the whole purpose of exploiting the living dog shit out of the countryside was to gain surplus agricultural produce to sell in the world market in order to industrially develop the Soviet Union. But might be wrong there. Maybe the mechanisms for that exploitation were different. The concept of Stalinist imperialism cannot be based on these familiar phenomena of modern capitalist imperialism, nor can the concept be based upon what Trotsky calls the, quote, historical geographical argument, end quote, which he groundlessly attributes to the minority, namely the fact that Stalinist expansion is following more or less the same geographical lines followed by the old Tsarist empire. We are not among those who readily cry, quote, imperialism, end quote, the minute the troops of one country cross the frontiers into another, ... The nature of Stalinist imperialism must be sought in the contradictions of the transitional economy of the Soviet Union and the relations of the, quote, bourgeois bureaucracy, end quote, to this economy. Our fundamental objection to the theory of, quote, socialism in a single country, end quote, has been that the contradictions inherent in its economy cannot be sought within the borders of one state. To the national limitedness of utopianism of the Stalinists, we cannot oppose the international socialist revolution. International Socialist Revolution. By that we mean the Russian Revolution must expand or die, exclamation point. Without, quote, state aid, end quote, from the working class in power in the economically and technologically more advanced countries of the world, the Russian Revolution could not maintain itself. Although this prognosis did not materialize in exactly the form it originally had, it nevertheless remained fundamentally correct. If the Russian Revolution did not collapse under the direct blows of the, quote, of the internal and external bourgeois counter-revolution, it has experienced a terrible degeneration. Stalin has not been able to establish socialism in the Soviet Union. That is, a harmoniously balanced, planned, crisis-free economic order. All the contradictory successes of the first 5-year plans are turning into their opposite under stress of economic and social forces beyond the control even of the all-powerful bureaucracy. The bureaucracy which first stimulated the development of the productive forces is now the principal brake on their development. The fixed capital of the early plans is reaching exhaustion. Quote, the tendency toward primitive accumulation created by want breaks out through innumerable pores of the planned economy, end quote. Trotsky, the thirst for, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote, for more privileges, for more wealth, for an increase in the national wealth, for an increase in the national income, and for a greater share of this income for itself, burns in the throats of the bureaucracy. The growth of Soviet industry has not brought the country closer to the Stalinist utopia of autarky, of economic self-sufficiency, but into greater dependence upon world economy. Right there, that's a contradiction in itself, right there. That's what I was talking about. The notion that if the Soviet Union does not export commodities or capital, what is the nature of this relationship to the world economy? If it's dependent upon the world economy, it means it's dependent upon trade with the world economy. It must give. It can't just take from the world economy. Under Lenin and Trotsky, the inherent contradictions of Soviet economy were to be solved on the international arena by revolutionary means. In those days, the dilemma, quote, expand or die, end quote, was to be solved by extending the Russian Revolution throughout the world. That, quote, policy of expansion, end quote, was in complete harmony with the interests of the world proletariat. It was directed consciously against world imperialism and not as an agency of imperialism. It meant the liberation of workers in other countries and not their enslavement. That is why the, quote, invasion of Poland in 1920 and the, quote, invasion of Georgia in the same period were of a fundamentally different character from Stalin's invasion of Poland, hand in hand with German imperialism. Under the Stalinist regime, the inherent contradictions of Soviet economy have increased and cannot be resolved by the purely military bureaucratic measures of the apparatus, quote, in one country, end quote. Nowadays, too, and in a sense far more acutely, the dilemma is still, quote, expand or die, end quote. But the Stalinist policy of expansion differs fundamentally from that of the revolutionary worker state years ago, precisely in that it is reactionary and counter-revolutionary. This policy is not based solely on the desire of the bureaucracy to assure itself militarily from attack by the imperialist powers. One of the main driving forces behind the policy of the bureaucracy is, quote, the tendency to expand its power, its prestige, its revenues, end quote. We call this policy Stalinist imperialism. To be sure, the Bonapartist bureaucracy cannot yet even hope of realizing the power or the dreams of the old capitalist imperialisms. To be sure, its own comparatively feeble economic base at home does not make possible the acquisition or domination of an empire in any way comparable to the British or French, but, quote, to each his proportionate share, end quote. The agent, or rather the minor partner of imperialism, must be content with a smaller share. The bureaucracy does not scoff at even such trifles as the oil wells of western Ukraine, the timber and nickel of Finland, the modest wealth of Vilna, every factory and store of which was sacked by the Stalinists before they turned over the city to Lithuania, the commercially important ports of the Baltic and the north of Finland, to say nothing of the thousands of workers of Lvov shipped under guard to work in the Donetsk coal mines, etc., etc. Marxists have analyzed and spoken of, quote, social imperialism, end quote, as the policy of one section of the working class, the labor aristocracy, and the bureaucracy corrupted by imperialism and enjoying a small share of the fruits of imperialist expansion. With even greater reason, it is possible to speak of Stalinist imperialism as the policy of the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. How can a worker state follow an imperialist policy? Or as some comrades put it, how can a nationalized economy follow an imperialist policy? The, quote, secret, end quote, lies in the fact that the nationalized economy does not, quote, follow, end quote, any policy. The automatism of Soviet economy is not at all guaranteed. Its character as a whole, quote, depends upon the character of the state power, end quote. The state power is in the hands of a gluttonous counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, which for a series of objective reasons has acquired an enormous relative independence from its economic base. Stalinist Bonapartism, in order to preserve itself, does not, quote, sweep away everywhere the establishments, end quote, of world capitalism. On the contrary, Stalinist Bonapartism helps maintain capitalism. Stalinist Bonapartism rightly fears the proletarian revolution abroad like the devil fears holy water, for the international revolution means the finish of Stalinist Bonapartism's power. The Stalinist Bonapartism proudly proclaims itself, and with justice, as the guardian of private property, in Spain, in Estonia, in Lithuania, in Latvia, and Finland, and it did not maintain private ownership in the western Ukraine and western White Russia, and if it did not maintain private ownership in the western Ukraine and western White Russia, it is essentially because the private owners, capitalists and landlords, who were 90% Polish in nationality, either fled to safer regions or had already been driven out by the insurrectionary peasants who rose in the land even before the arrival of the Red Army. Footnote: Trotsky commented on this in Defense of Marxism. Shachtman evidently still thinks in terms of the restoration of capitalism. Trotsky, though he mislabels it, has a more realistic grasp of things as they are, of the independence and solidity of the USSR system. Shachtman, following Trotsky, will understand. End footnote. Here, too, it has been shown that there is no mechanical relationship between the nationalized property existing in the Soviet Union and the policies, even the economic policies of the Stalinist regime. There is not the slightest doubt that if the Polish bourgeoisie and landlords had consented to collaborate with the Stalinists, their private property would have been preserved intact by the Kremlin and its army, exactly as was the case in Spain and as is the case in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The program of the Kusanen, government, in Teriyaki, Terioki, or Teriyaki, I don't know. The program of the Kusanen, government in Teriyaki, that it, with its explicit opposition to expropriating the bourgeoisie, represents an assurance from the Stalinists that they will protect the social interests of the French bourgeoisie if the latter will act like the bourgeoisie of the three Baltic countries. The peculiar relationship of the Stalinist bureaucracy of the political regime, which has acquired such an enormous degree of independence to the contradictions of Soviet economy, enables it, and to a growing extent compels it, to pursue an imperialist policy, not only as an agent of capitalist imperialism, but an imperialist policy of its own. Is this not a mere matter of terminology, a desire to avenge ourselves for Stalinist crimes by the employment of, strong language? No. Without an understanding of this new phenomenon, a clear political line is impossible, and that for several reasons. 1. The majority has, for example, shown a complete inability to analyze and understand the, new turn, of the Communist International. The official analysis made of the, turn, by the representatives of the Cannon Group and the Socialist Appeal was woefully superficial, and that is the best that can be said of it. Although Stalin capitulated to Hitler, he is no mere tool of Germany. The, agent, plays an independent role in the, axis. Not only does the Comintern allow itself a few guarded but nonetheless significant remarks about the need of a, revolution, in Germany, something it spoke and acted against in the most violent manner in France during the, fourth period, but it is also carrying on a, revolutionary, agitation in those countries into which the Stalinist bureaucracy hopes next to direct its expansion. Does this mean that the Stalinists have turned revolutionary? Not for a minute. The Stalinist bureaucracy, the Stalinist bureaucracy's regime, the Stalinist bureaucracy's policies, the Stalinist bureaucracy's Comintern remain fundamentally counter-revolutionary. The Stalinist bureaucracy's, rousing of the people, in such countries as Romania, Yugoslavia, Iran, Iraq, India, and elsewhere, has essentially the same significance as Hitler's or Mussolini's, rousing of the people, support, of the nationalist movement in Great Britain's Arabian Empire. Such as the British Mandate in Palestine. In passing, it does not follow that the independent revolutionary movements in these countries should refuse to accept and use Stalinist aid for their own purposes, just as the Irish in 1916 accepted and used German aid, but in return they need not facilitate the victory of Stalinism and the Red Army. Whatever revolutionary struggle is developed by the masses in these countries will be crushed by the Stalinist counter-revolution if it intervenes, and the peoples will be brought under the oppressive domination of the reactionary bureaucracy and its imperialist ambitions. The service which the, new turn, of the Communist International is doing to the Berlin-Moscow axis as a whole, more specifically to German imperialism, is not the main objective of the, new turn, It is calculated to serve the expansionist interests of the independent, i.e. semi-independent Stalinist bureaucracy. It is in this light that the, turn, must be explained to the masses so that their revolutionary interests may be properly safeguarded. 2. We were and remain against the seizures of new territories by the Kremlin, As already mentioned above, one of the theorists of the Cannon Group has explained that, Trotsky is merely restating here the classic Marxist position on self-determination, In other words, the seizure of new territories, Western Galicia, Estonia, Finland, etc., is a violation of the right of self-determination, and that is why, we were and remained against, such seizures. In the past, however, we did not object to the violation of this right, provided it was in the interest of the defense of the Soviet Union. In the past, however, we did not object to the violation of this right, provided it was in the interest of the defense of the Soviet Union. Quote, no Marxist who does not break with the fundamentals of Marxism and socialism, end quote, wrote Lenin in 1918, quote, will be able to deny that the interests of socialism stand higher than the interests of the self-determination of a people, end quote. Quite correct. Self-determination is a bourgeois democratic right. Self-determination is a bourgeois democratic right. We defend this right with the utmost intransigence against reactionary bourgeois or imperialist interests and, quote, rights, and in the interests of democracy and socialism. But in those cases where this bourgeois democratic right conflicts with proletarian internationalist rights, with socialist interests, and only in those cases, we subordinate the former to the latter, and are even prepared to reject the former in the interests of the latter. According to this entirely correct Marxian point of view, the formula of Trotsky should read, quote, we are against the seizure of new territories by the Kremlin because it violates the right of self-determination, but we are for the violation even of this democratic right if it serves the socialist right of the defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. But in that case, it would be necessary to say one of two things, and not both. A, what is involved in the present case is the defense of the Soviet Union and the violation of self-determination in Poland, Estonia, and Finland is either of secondary or of no importance. Consequently, the formula, quote, we are against the seizure of new territories by the Kremlin, end quote, has no concrete meaning or purpose now. Or B, what is involved in the present case is not the defense of the Soviet Union. Consequently, we are for the right of self-determination in Poland, Estonia, and Finland, and against Stalin's seizure of these territories. And Trotsky's formula does have concrete meaning and purpose. In the first case, we would have to say that despite the violation of the right of self-determination, it is necessary to give material and military aid to those who are violating the right. In the second case, we would have to say that because we are for this right, we do not give military and material aid to those who are violating it. In other words, in the concrete case, it is impossible to maintain and support both. If we do not subordinate the basically democratic right of self-determination, if we do not support the seizure of new territories by Stalin to support of the Red Army in the present war, it can only be because it is not a basically socialist war for the defense of the Soviet Union. It is, as the minority has emphasized, a reactionary war for the realization of the Stalinist bureaucracy's aims at imperialist expansion. Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm recording. Okay. Where am I? It is, as the minority has emphasized, a reactionary war for the realization of the Stalinist bureaucracy's aims at imperialist expansion. To the interests of that war of those aims, we cannot and must not subordinate the right of self-determination. It need hardly be added that the Finnish bourgeoisie, which is conducting the war against the Soviet army, is not fighting to maintain Finland's right to national independence, any more than the Serbian bourgeoisie was fighting against Austro-Hungary. I think it's supposed to be Serbia, but I guess maybe that's how you used to spell Serbia. Let me repeat the whole thing. It need hardly be added that the Finnish bourgeoisie, which is conducting the war against the Soviet army, is not fighting to maintain Finland's right to national independence, any more than the Serbian bourgeoisie was fighting Austro-Hungary in 1914 for Serbia's right to national independence. In both cases, the national independence of the country is a myth. In the latter, the country was a vassal of Russian imperialism, and in the former, the country and its bourgeoisie are vassals of Anglo-French imperialism. The struggle for the genuine national independence of Finland can be conducted only by the independent Finnish proletarian struggle for power. Since the struggle for national independence in that country is inseparably bound up with the working class struggle for a socialist Finland, hence the main enemy of the Finnish masses remains at home, the Finnish bourgeoisie. The problem of the Ukraine may be understood and posed more clearly in the light of our standpoint. The Fourth International favors the right of self-determination for the masses of the present Soviet Ukraine, and for their separation from the Soviet Union, and their unification with other Ukrainian peoples into a united independent Soviet Ukraine. Why? Because the Stalinist regime oppresses the Ukrainian masses, but it oppresses the great Russian masses too. That is true, our opponents will reply, and that is why we raise the slogan of the political revolution against the Kremlin bureaucracy, a slogan applying to the whole of the Soviet Union. But the point is that for the Ukraine we have added to the slogan of political revolution the slogan of separation, precisely because in the Ukraine Stalinist oppression is also national oppression. But in this point, for the Ukraine, we have added to the slogan of political revolution the slogan of separation, precisely because in the Ukraine, Stalinist oppression is also national oppression. What is the character of this national oppression? Is it sufficient to say that it is, quote, bureaucratic, end quote? But that would not distinguish it from Stalinist oppression in the rest of the Soviet Union, which is, like oppression in general, also bureaucratic. For the distinguishing slogan in the Ukraine, a distinguishing reason must be found. It lies in the fact that the Stalinist Muscovite bureaucracy, with its great Russian nationalist outlook, detected by Lenin and Stalin years ago, and ideology, with its contempt for and repression of Ukrainian national culture, with its exploitation of the resources of the country, mainly in the interests of the Kremlin parasites, oppresses the Ukraine in an imperialist manner. It is not accidental that the Fourth International has raised for the Soviet Ukrainian masses the same slogan that it raises for the Ukrainian masses who are imperialistically oppressed in countries like Hungary, Romania, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. One second. One second, sorry. Had to copy that down. The analysis of the Stalinist imperialism makes it impossible for the revolutionary vanguard more easily and clearly, quote, to distinguish where and when the Red Army is acting solely as an instrument of the Bonapartist reaction, and where it defends the social basis of the USSR, end quote. Trotsky. But your position, it may be said, completely excludes any defense of the Soviet Union under Stalinist domination, for how can we defend imperialists? Not at all. In the case of the Soviet Union, when the social imperialist bureaucracy is conducting a reactionary war of expansion, we are not defensist. We subordinate the defense of the Soviet Union to the intensification of the revolutionary struggle to overthrow the Stalinist regime. We are revolutionary defeatists. When the same bureaucracy is compelled to conduct a war to defend the Soviet Union from imperialism, and therefore to deal willy-nilly a blow at the latter's hope to restore itself to new vigor by dismembering the Soviet Union, is playing an objectively progressive role, and we are for the defense of the Soviet Union, that is, retaining our full political independence. We give material and military aid to the Soviets' armed forces in spite of their domination by the bureaucracy. The slogan of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, as understood and interpreted by the Fourth International up till now, is still understood and interpreted by the Cannon Group, makes it impossible for us to adopt officially the position which has been elaborated in this document. Our past slogan must be revised. Defense of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union is conducting a reactionary war, a war solely or predominantly in the interest of the bureaucracy and its imperialist expansion, a war against the interests of the world revolution? ? No. I feel like I read that weird. I want to read that again. Defense of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union is conducting a reactionary war, a war solely or predominantly in the interest of the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy's imperialist expansionism, a war against the interest of the world revolution? Question mark? No! Exclamation point. Defense of the Soviet Union when it is conducting a progressive war against imperialism in the interest of the world revolution? Yes! Exclamation point. The end. Thank you for listening.